What the world expected to end at the negotiating table may instead end at sea. 47 days after the first American strikes on Iran, we are no longer looking at a simple regional war, and we are definitely not looking at a clean diplomatic resolution. What has emerged is something far more dangerous. Two nuclear powers facing each other across one of the narrowest and most important waterways on Earth, while American warships enforce a blockade and China signals in public that it intends to keep moving through anyway. That is the reality now. No signed peace accord, no surrender, no handover of uranium, no final agreement anyone can point to and say the crisis is contained. Instead, the Strait of Hormuz has become the stage for a high-stakes test of power, nerve, and credibility between Washington and Beijing, with Iran at the center of it, and the global economy hanging over the edge. At 10 a.m. Eastern on Monday, U.S. Central Command launched what may be the most consequential naval move made by an American president since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The message was direct and impossible to misunderstand. Any vessel entering or leaving the restricted zone without authorization could be intercepted, diverted, or seized. In practical terms, that meant ships tied to Iranian ports were now exposed to direct American enforcement action. And then China responded in a way that turned a regional pressure campaign into a global confrontation. Beijing did not hedge. It did not wait. It did not hide behind vague diplomatic language. Chinese officials said their vessels would continue to move through the Strait of Hormuz. They reaffirmed their trade and energy agreements with Iran. They said those agreements would be honored. They also made it clear they expected outside powers not to interfere. Then came the line that truly raised the temperature. Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran has opened it to China. That statement landed at the exact moment the United States was trying to prove the opposite with warships. So now picture the scene. America is saying Iranian-linked maritime access can be blocked. China is saying that access remains open to Chinese shipping. U.S. destroyers are already in position. A temporary ceasefire is ticking toward an April 21st expiration. No nuclear agreement has been signed. Another round of talks may happen within days. And one of the cleanest summaries of this entire situation came from Bloomberg, which put it bluntly. This blockade is not only about Iran, it is also about China. And that is the part many people are still missing. This is no longer just about punishing Tehran or forcing a nuclear compromise. What is unfolding in Hormuz looks increasingly like the first major direct contest between the United States and China over control of a shipping lane the entire world depends on. This is not a side story to the Iran war. It may become the main story. Every piece of this matters. The mechanics of the blockade matter. The breakdown of the Islamabad talks matters. The ceasefire deadline matters. China's wording matters. France's sudden diplomatic activism matters. Even the legal ambiguity matters, because when military forces operate in legally gray space, the margin for miscalculation gets dangerously thin. To understand why this blockade is such an enormous move, you have to go back to what happened before it was announced. This was not Washington acting from a position of diplomatic success. It was the opposite. The blockade came after what may turn out to be the most important negotiating failure of Trump's second term. On April 11, 2026, J.D. Vance arrived in Islamabad with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. It was the most senior American team assembled for direct foreign policy talks under this administration. Across from them sat Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and Iranian Parliamentary Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. Even getting that Iranian delegation to Pakistan required extraordinary security. Pakistani Air Force fighters, J-10Cs, JF-17s, and AWACS aircraft reportedly helped protect the route. That alone tells you how serious the environment had become. The negotiators were not flying into a peaceful summit. They were moving through a live war zone under military escort. For 21 hours, Washington and Tehran held direct, face-to-face talks at the highest level seen since the 1979 Iranian Revolution. That is not a small detail. That is historic by itself. But history does not guarantee results. When Vance left on April 12th, his message was unmistakable. Iran had rejected American terms. His public framing centered on one demand above all others. The United States wanted a clear commitment that Iran would neither pursue a nuclear weapon nor preserve the capability to assemble one quickly. That was the core dispute, not rhetoric, not symbolism, not some side issue. The fight came down to enrichment, stockpiles, and the verification structure of any future agreement. In other words, the same nuclear problem that helped trigger the war remained unresolved even after 21 hours of high-level diplomacy. Iran, for its part, told a different story. Araghchi argued that the two sides had approached an understanding but then ran into maximalist demands, shifting conditions, and coercive pressure. Ghalibaf said Washington failed to build trust, and when you step back, the underlying problem becomes obvious. Iran does not believe any agreement will necessarily survive future American or Israeli political decisions. Washington does not believe Iran will refrain from quietly rebuilding once military and economic pressure is relaxed. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a structural deadlock. So, the talks ended. No deal, no breakthrough. And almost immediately, the blockade followed. But this is where the real strategic logic comes into focus, because the blockade is not just a naval maneuver in the old-fashioned sense. It is not simply about physically stopping ships. It is a pressure device aimed at the economic engine behind Iran's wartime resilience. And that engine is China. Without Chinese demand, Iran's sanctioned oil trade does not function at anything close to its current scale. Before this war, Beijing was absorbing roughly 95% of Iran's crude exports through a complicated network of sanctioned tankers, intermediaries, and opaque financial arrangements. That means the White House is not merely trying to squeeze Tehran. It is trying to put Beijing in a position where it must either pressure Iran to accept American terms or openly challenge the blockade. That is why Bloomberg's framing matters. This is a move aimed at both capitals, not one. Look at the numbers. Last year, China imported about 1.4 million barrels per day of Iranian crude out of roughly 10.4 million barrels per day of total seaborne crude imports. That is not a symbolic energy relationship. That is a real piece of China's industrial bloodstream. That oil feeds factories, power generation, logistics, transport, and industrial output. And to get there, it moves through Hormuz, the same narrow corridor where American destroyers now have orders to stop, redirect, or seize vessels connected to Iranian ports. That means Trump is not using this blockade primarily to bankrupt Iran overnight. Iran's export capacity has already been disrupted by the war. The bigger objective is to force a decision in Beijing. Will China lean on Tehran to compromise, or will it test American enforcement at sea? Those are the choices. And Beijing's public language suggests it does not want to appear intimidated. Its response evolved fast. First came criticism. The blockade was called reckless and dangerous. Then came a harder edge. Chinese officials repeated that their ships would continue moving through the strait, that their trade and energy commitments to Iran remain valid, and that outside interference is unacceptable. The pattern was familiar to anyone who watches Chinese diplomacy closely. The sequence usually goes like this: official objection, firmer public position, then action. That is why the central question now is not abstract. It is brutally simple. Will China accept humiliation over Hormuz, or will it resist in a way that forces a physical test? Under the law of the sea, ships on the high seas generally fall under the exclusive jurisdiction of the state whose flag they fly. So imagine the scenario everyone is quietly gaming out. A Chinese-flagged tanker is signaled by a U.S. Navy destroyer to stop. It refuses. If the Americans choose to enforce the order, the next step is boarding. And if there are Chinese security personnel or Marines aboard, then the world is suddenly staring at the possibility of armed contact between US and Chinese personnel in one of the most sensitive waterways on the planet. Now take it one step further. What if Chinese naval escorts accompany those tankers? What if one side interprets a maneuver as hostile? What if a warning shot is answered? What if a Chinese military vessel fires on an American ship, or an American boarding attempt triggers an exchange no one can quickly contain? That is why this moment is so alarming. There has not been a direct maritime confrontation between nuclear powers at this level since the Cold War era. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Soviet ships turned back before a direct clash occurred. A secret bargain helped pull the world away from disaster. The question in April 2026 is whether a similar off-ramp exists now, and whether it can be found before somebody refuses to stop. And that is what makes the transformation of this conflict so extraordinary. Less than 7 weeks ago, the war was framed as a US-Israel campaign targeting Iran's nuclear and military infrastructure. Now it has escalated into a crisis in which the United States is enforcing a blockade in the most critical energy choke point in the world. China is publicly indicating it will keep using that route. Russia is visibly coordinating with Beijing, and Europe is suddenly trying to invent a diplomatic escape hatch before the whole thing spins into something much larger. That is where France enters the picture. One reason Paris matters here is that France may be one of the few actors capable of proposing a solution neither Washington nor Beijing has to publicly reject on day one. President Emmanuel Macron announced preparations for a peaceful multinational mission intended to restore freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. Britain was brought into the plan. A conference was expected in the coming days. This matters because a French-British-led multinational framework offers something neither side currently has: a face-saving compromise. If China backs a broader international mission rather than openly defying a purely American blockade, it may be able to keep oil flowing without appearing to submit to Washington. If the United States can shift from unilateral enforcement toward a wider maritime structure, it may reduce the chance of a direct US-China collision while still maintaining pressure. If Iran can frame the arrangement as something other than surrender to US force, it may buy time without total humiliation. That is why this proposal is more than diplomatic theater. It may be the first real off-ramp anyone has offered that all sides could theoretically live with, at least temporarily. For Beijing, that kind of arrangement would be attractive for obvious reasons. It keeps energy moving, it preserves relations with Iran, it avoids a direct naval showdown with the United States. It also helps China avoid looking weak in the eyes of its own public and its partners. For Washington, it may lower the risk of the first major US-China maritime clash in generations. For Europe, it opens a path to relevance in a crisis that could wreck global trade and energy markets. The problem is timing. Off-ramps only matter if they appear before the point of contact. Once a tanker refuses an order, once a boarding team is launched, once a missile boat makes an aggressive pass, the diplomatic window narrows fast. And that is what makes the current balance so unstable. Every major power now occupies a different position relative to the blockade, and none of those positions is comfortable. The United States is enforcing maritime pressure on Iranian-linked shipping and treating payments to Iran as grounds for interdiction. Iran has called the blockade piracy and moved to maximum combat alert. The IRGC has warned that any military vessel approaching Hormuz will face a firm response. China says its ships will continue moving because Iran has opened the passage to them. Russia's Lavrov arrived in Beijing to a red carpet reception and aligned publicly with China on de-escalation, which in practical terms looks a lot like political resistance to the American approach. France and Britain are trying to build a multinational navigation mission. Pakistan is floating the possibility of another round of talks in Islamabad. Vance says a grand bargain is still possible if Iran moves. Iranian officials say the United States has already proved it cannot be trusted. Over all of this hangs the April 21st ceasefire deadline, That deadline matters for another reason too. Iran has not been sitting still during the pause. Satellite imagery indicates Tehran has been using the ceasefire to clear debris from the entrances of underground missile facilities, reopen access to its so-called missile cities, and restore launch capability. In plain English, Iran appears to be digging out, reactivating hardened infrastructure, and getting ready in case the shooting starts again. That is consistent with Iran's broader military logic. Survive the first blow, preserve as much capability as possible underground, absorb damage, reopen access, then resume fire when conditions allow. Analysts at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies have essentially said the same thing. Ceasefires often give the damaged side an opportunity to rebuild at least part of what was just hit. That is not a loophole. That is how war works. So now you have a strange and deeply unstable combination. Iran is reconstituting military capacity under cover of a ceasefire. The United States is undermining the same ceasefire with a naval blockade. China is publicly refusing to treat the blockade as final, and the nuclear dispute that caused the Islamabad talks to collapse remains unresolved. That is not a durable peace. It is a pause with explosives wired underneath it. There is also a serious legal contradiction embedded in the blockade itself. CENTCOM has said the action applies to ships entering or leaving Iranian ports and coastal areas, but not to freedom of navigation for vessels moving through Hormuz to non-Iranian destinations. On paper, that distinction sounds neat. In practice, it raises a mess of questions. What happens when a Chinese-flagged vessel says it is transiting to China, but its movement depends on Iranian permission, Iranian waters, or Iranian commercial arrangements? Does that count as normal transit? Does it fall under the blockade? Does international law shield it as third-party navigation? Or does the American position override that because of the vessel's effective connection to Iranian trade? These are not academic questions anymore. Commercial shipping firms are now being forced to evaluate route decisions in real time based not only on freight rates and market demand, but on overlapping sovereign claims backed by armed force. A ship may need Iranian permission to pass. It may also face an American destroyer demanding compliance. Its exposure depends on its flag, destination, paperwork, tolls, affiliations, and timing. That is not stable maritime order. That is a floating legal minefield. And while all of this is playing out at sea, the nuclear issue remains the unresolved core of the war. The Islamabad talks did not fail over optics. They failed over the same question that existed before the bombs fell. What exactly would Iran have to give up? And what exactly would the United States have to believe? Vance's formulation after the talks made the American position clear. Washington wants a firm, explicit commitment that Iran will not seek a nuclear weapon and will not retain the means to reach one rapidly. Iran's answer has stayed essentially the same throughout the conflict. It insists its nuclear program is civilian. It says it never sought a bomb. And it rejects the idea of surrendering through negotiation what could not be fully destroyed by force. That means the critical pieces still exist. Uranium remains in hardened sites like Isfahan and Natanz. The centrifuges have not been erased from history. The expertise has not disappeared. And now, during a ceasefire that expires in days, Iran is also reopening the underground infrastructure connected to the missile campaign that has already shaped this war. Those two realities now coexist. The nuclear capability question remains unresolved, and the military launch network is being restored at the same time. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a U.S. naval blockade activated at 10 a.m. Eastern on Monday, April 13, 2026, the 44th day of Operation Epic Fury, immediately after 21 hours of direct U.S.-Iran negotiations in Islamabad, ended without agreement. It leaves us with American warnings that ships entering or leaving Iranian ports without authorization may be intercepted, diverted, or captured. It leaves us with Trump saying vessels that pay Iranian tolls risk destruction if they approach the blockade line. It leaves us with Iran calling the move piracy and putting its forces on full alert. It leaves us with the IRGC warning that military vessels near Hormuz will get a hard response. It leaves us with China publicly stating that its ships will continue moving through the strait, that its agreements with Iran remain valid, and that Iran has opened the route to China. It leaves us with Lavrov in Beijing, Russia and China coordinating politically, and France and Britain trying to assemble a multinational maritime alternative before events outrun diplomacy. It leaves us with talk of a second round in Islamabad. It leaves us with evidence that Iran is clearing blocked missile base entrances during the ceasefire. It leaves us with reports that 2 sanctioned tankers transited the strait despite the blockade. And it leaves us with one unavoidable conclusion. This crisis now reaches far beyond Iran. Somewhere in those 21 miles of water, an American destroyer and a Chinese-linked tanker may be moving toward a decision point that neither side truly wants to own in public. That moment could become the most dangerous naval confrontation between nuclear powers since the Cold War. Or it could become one of those near catastrophes history remembers as the weak diplomacy somehow held at the last possible second. That is what the next 6 days are about. By April 21st, the ceasefire clock runs out. Before then, there may be another round of talks. Before then, Europe may try to force a diplomatic framework into existence. Before then, back-channel bargaining may find the kind of compromise no leader can openly advertise. Or, before then, something may happen at sea that changes the entire trajectory of this conflict in minutes. Because that narrow waterway does not just carry ships. It carries roughly 1/5 of the world's energy supply, the credibility of the United States, the strategic pride of China, the survival calculations of Iran, the anxieties of global markets, and one of the biggest unanswered questions in modern geopolitics. When 2 great powers decide they cannot back down, what happens when the world's most important choke point becomes the place they test each other? That is why every tanker matters now. Every destroyer movement matters. Every line from Islamabad matters. Every satellite image matters. Every market reaction matters. The stakes are not theoretical anymore. They are physical, immediate, and global. And the uncomfortable truth is this. The most dangerous phase may not have started with the bombing. It may be starting now, in the strait, where diplomacy still has a few days to work, and where one wrong move could turn a regional war into something the world is not ready to absorb.